Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Okay, wonderful. So I'm delighted to welcome you all to the launch of the Athena Initiative, Advancing Human Security in International Affairs. This is a new initiative being created by the Elliott School of International Affairs, George Washington University, that will work across all of our programs. My name is Dr. Shirley Graham, and I am the director of the Athena Initiative. And I am delighted to be the director of the Athena Initiative. The initiative was born out of many conversations with students, faculty, and practitioners working in the field of international affairs and foreign policy here in Washington, D.C. We are all deeply concerned by the authoritarian turn that is taking place globally and the eradication of the freedoms that many of us have taken for granted. The hyperpolarization of political views in our countries are being added to and aided by AI algorithms, misinformation, and disinformation. Social media is being weaponized to enact high levels of technology-facilitated violence against women and girls, who are the highest percentage of victims of deepfakes, 99%. These targets are deliberate. They are a specific goal to humiliate and silence women in an attempt to stop them from speaking out or running for political office, and thereby eroding our democratic institutions. At the same time, we are witnessing an escalation in violent conflicts, hypermilitarization, man-made famines, and genocide. We are watching as millions of people are being forcibly displaced. Currently, 122 million, the highest in record historically. As conflicts compounded by climate crisis, food insecurity, and water shortages are forcing people to flee. In all of these crises, the voice of the most marginalized people are the ones that are most silenced. Here in the Athena Initiative, we will be centering those voices, particularly the voices of women and girls. The Athena Initiative was named after the Greek goddess of wisdom, because we want to channel her energy and her wisdom, which is represented not only by her, but by many goddesses in many different cultures. For example, Saraswati, who is the Indian Hindu goddess, or Kuan who is the Chinese Buddhist goddess, and Ankaliak, the ancient Irish pagan goddess. Our aim is to open spaces for dialogue and constructive conversation, to gather and expand our community with a focus on finding creative responses and strategic solutions to these crises. We stand for freedom of speech, which authoritarian regimes do not. And we therefore want to give voice to those who are typically silenced, and authoritarian regimes prefer to silence those they do not agree with. So we will convene events that bring together scholars, practitioners, and members of civil society to envision a world without war, a world without hunger, a world where peace and justice prevail. Some of our future events will include a conversation with the Colombian Ambassador for Women, Peace and Security, Dr. Arlene Tickner, a conference co-hosted with Women in International Security, 2 book launches, and training workshops on advocating for peace and security. Now, moving to the topic of today's discussion. Last week, on the 16th of September, was the 3rd anniversary of Mahsa Amini's death, who was in the custody of the morality police for allegedly not wearing her hijab appropriately. It was this 22-year-old Kurdish woman's death that sparked the Woman Life Freedom movement. So it is fitting that the Athena Initiative's inaugural event would continue this conversation. It is resistance movements such as the Woman Life Freedom Movement or the Zan Zendegi Azadi movement and the courage of the Iranian people, particularly its women, that can create this change that I'm speaking about today. But before I go on, I must mention that the content of today's conversation may be triggering for many of us. The United Nations fact-finding mission on the Islamic Republic of Iran stated in its first report in March 2024 that the Iranian authorities' deadly crackdown on the protests resulted in serious human rights violations and crimes against humanity, including murder, torture, and rape. Hundreds of people were killed, and girls as young as 15 and 16 were shot in the eyes. The BBC reported how one young woman, a PhD student, said, "You aimed at my eyes, but my heart is still beating. Thank you for taking the sight from my eye, which has opened the eyes of so many people." Human Rights Watch reported that despite widespread domestic and international demands for accountability, the authorities have dismissed complaints by victims and their families and persecuted families of those killed and executed. As Erica Chenoweth and Zoe Mark said in an article in Foreign Affairs, aspiring autocrats and patriarchal authoritarians have good reason to fear women's political participation. When women participate in mass movements, those movements are both more likely to succeed and more likely to lead to more egalitarian democracies. In other words, fully free, politically active women are a threat to authoritarian and authoritarian-leaning leaders. And so those leaders have a strategic reason to be sexist. Today's event is the fourth in a series of events that we have held here at the Elliott School, George Washington University, on the women-led freedom movement in Iran. In November 2022, the Middle East Policy Forum discussed the question, protests in Iran, what is the difference this time? The panel included Dr. Norma Claire Maruzzi, Professor of Political Science and Women's Studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And she said, for change to happen, it can't simply be only street protests. It is going to have to incorporate many more layers of society and for the population who are sympathetic to try and figure out how to go forward. And we will be hearing more about that topic in our discussion today. 6 months later, on International Women's Day, we invited esteemed author and academic Azar Nafisi to join us to discuss her experiences as an Iranian American woman, professor, and writer. She shared that when the women of Iran marched in Tehran in 1979, they were chanting that freedom is neither Western nor Eastern, it is global. In her book, Read Dangerously, she asked the question, how do we deal with our enemy without either becoming like them or surrendering to them? She says that writers who have lived on the edge of trauma and danger have found literature and imagination not only important, but vital to their well-being and survival. It is this imagination that can replace rifts created by politics and instead forge connections. And that is what we're aiming to do with the Athena Initiative, create a space where we can really bring in our imagination as well as our knowledge. Our most recent event took place earlier this year during Women's History Month, when Dr. Kelly Shannon, a historian and visiting scholar at the Institute for Middle East Studies, shared that this movement was built on over a century of Iranian women's rights activism. So, to bring us up to date today with the Mahsa Movement and how it was developed and responses by the regime, civil society, and other actors, we have our new director of the Middle East Studies MA program, Dr. Sina Azodi, here to guide us through this conversation. We are delighted to be joined by three eminent and award-winning experts on this topic. Barbara Slavin, Shirin Saeidi, and Emily Blout. Let me tell you a little about each of them before we begin. Barbara Slavin is a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center in Washington and a lecturer in international affairs here at George Washington University. Prior to joining Stimson, she founded and directed the Future of Iran Initiative at the Atlantic Council and led a bipartisan task force on Iran. She's the author of a book titled Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, Iran and the US and the Twisted Path to Confrontation. She has traveled to Iran 9 times, and she is a regular commentator on US foreign policy and Iran on NPR, PBS, and C-SPAN, who are here with us today. Dr. Shirin Saeidi is an associate professor of political science and the director of the King Fayed Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Arkansas. She earned her PhD in politics and international affairs from Cambridge University. She has published numerous articles and book chapters that have appeared in the International Journal of Middle East Studies and the American Journal of Islamic Social Sciences, amongst others. Her book, Women and the Islamic Republic, How Gendered Citizenship Conditions the Iranian State, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2022. Dr. Emily Blout is a media scholar and historian with subject matter expertise on propaganda, information operations, and media manipulation by state and non-state actors. She is the author of the book Media and Power in Iran, in Modern Iran, Mass Communication, Ideology, and the State, which examines the political and technological history of media in Iran over the course of more than 8 decades and 2 political regimes, from Imperial Iran to the Islamic Republic. Emily holds a PhD in Iranian Studies from the University of St. Andrews. And of course, our moderator, Dr. Sina Azodi, who is an assistant professor of Middle East Studies and director of the MA in Middle East Studies program at the Elliott School. He teaches graduate and undergraduate classes on international security, Iran's foreign policy, and national security strategy. He is also the author of a forthcoming book, Iran and the Bomb, the United States, Iran, and the Nuclear Question. He earned his BA and MA in International Affairs from the Elliott School and his PhD from the University of South Florida. Okay, so here's the format of today's discussion, so you all have a very clear time frame of what's going to happen. We're going to have a 45-minute discussion with our panelists, then we're going to open up for Q&A for 30 minutes, and then we're hoping we'll have 10 or 15 minutes at the end for you to network and mingle. So now I'm going to hand over to Sina and our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us.
I want to thank my, my friend and colleague, Professor Graham, and congratulations on the new initiative. And as you just heard, I have very relevant expertise to this topic, nuclear deterrence. And so thank you for letting me sit here. I also want to thank my friends and colleagues who came all over to participate in the discussion. Barbara, a friend and mentor for more than a decade now. She's kind, she's generous, and she edited my book chapters, 5 of them, I think. Her classes on US-Iran relations are very popular here, after mine, of course. And Shirin, excuse me, a friend who, despite all the hatred, came all the way from Arkansas to share with us her insights. And last but not least, my friend Emily, with whom I had the pleasure of participating on a CENTCOM panel last year in Tampa, Florida, and co-authoring a piece in 2023, I think, on the Mahsa Amini movement. It was a very good piece, by the way. I'm going to ask panelists a series of questions. We open it, as Shirley mentioned, Q&A. If you have a question, raise your hand. The microphone are very capable program coordinator sitting in the back, Anissa, will bring the mic. You can ask the question. Please note that every question ends with a question mark at the end. We are an academic institution. We do support freedom of speech, but we do not accept any disruptions. So I'll start just a little background. Iranian women have been important actors in the country's political history. from Queen Amistress of the Achaemenid Empire, who wielded considerable power over the royal succession process and eliminated, rather brutally, her powerful rivals, to Malek Jahan Khanum, the formidable queen mother of the Qajar dynasty in the 19th century. Their presence have been always felt. In more recent history, we have Iranian women who participated in the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and the Iran-Iraq War, defying expectations to assert themselves in Iran's public and political spheres. But the Mahsa movement marked a profound turning point. For the first time in modern Iranian history, a movement centered on the rights and dignity of women, not framed by broader nationalistic causes, sparked nationwide and global protests. It was a moment of moral clarity and historical rupture. Iranian women were not just participants in a broader struggle, they were its heart, its symbol, and its leaders. So who was Mahsa Amini? Shirley, I'll briefly mention, I'll repeat it, I apologize. She was a young Iranian woman from the province of Kurdistan who was arrested by Iran's law enforcement forces in September 2022 for what they deemed improper hijab. She soon died in captivity after being severely beaten by arresting officers. A tragic murder by the security forces unleashed widespread protests across Iran, resulting in the killing and injury of several hundred more people and women. Young men and women were shot in the eye, stomach, and in the back from very close distance. Through extreme brutality, the violence and media censorship, the Islamic Republic quelled the uprising. Mahsa became a martyr for Iranian women's quest for freedom. But I believe that although, as a political scientist, although Mahsa's movement was not a revolution itself, that's why I call it a movement, not a revolution, it was suppressed, but it had its own successes. We're here to discuss the successes and the failures of this popular movement that, in my view, shaped Iran's politics forever. So I'll start with Shirin, and then we move forward. You've written on this topic. So I was wondering if you could briefly talk about the history of Iranian women's involvement in the political sphere, their successes, their failures. So
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Sina, and thank you to everyone who's here, and also to George Washington University, who is a university that has consistently led in the freedom of speech. It's an honor to be here and to be with you all. I think it's really important to understand the Mahsa Amini uprising movement. I think there's a lot in the literature about how the distinction between movements and revolutions is not as significant as it once was, because from a movement, you can still have quite radical changes of the political structures, which I believe have occurred. But Iranian women, particularly after the 1979 revolution, and when I say Iranian women, I mean women, non-elite women, women who are not coming from a background where they were encouraged to be involved in politics, where they were encouraged to be involved in social and political life. The 1979 revolution opened the doors somewhat accidentally. The new establishment, the Islamic Republic, needed the support of half the population for the revolution to sustain. And in that sense, women were encouraged by the highest levels of the state, of the religious establishment. And this is important for families that are more traditional and religious, and who historically would not even allow, and I think this is important to remember, there were families who were so devout and religious that they would not allow their daughters to even participate in protests in support of Ayatollah Khomeini. So it's that population of women that historically had never been active that became activated with the 1979 revolution. And so after the revolution, we see women in various spheres of political and social life. We see them, as Sina said, active in the Iran-Iraq war. We see women who continue their opposition activism with different oppositional groups, leftist organizations. We had many women who endured prison and torture and death. And so there's a history of resisting the state. And I would argue it's so extensive. In my book, I argue that it develops into a kind of citizenship. So the most common kind of citizenship that exists in Iran today is an activist one. And I also argue that it is led by women. In my book that was published in 2022, I argued that any changes that happen structurally to the future of Iran, we have the women of Iran to thank for that. And I believe that the Mahsa Amini uprising, movement, revolution, call it whatever you like, broke those boundaries for women. And so I'll stop here and let other people.
Sure. Okay. I have a lot of questions. So I want to go to Emily. You've written on this topic, the coercive tactics of states. You recently had a very good piece, which I read this morning for Barbara. It was very good. Please read it. So can you tell us about, the Mahsa movement and some of its successes, its failures? Why do you think it failed? And again, I have more questions, but for now.
Thank you, Sina, and thank you, Dr. Graham, for having us. I appreciate being part of this important initiative. So I'd like to talk about the regime response to the protests.
Yes.
So if I had to put it in 4 words, I'd say ruthless, relentless, and all-encompassing. Before I talk about that, I do want to talk about how people protested. So the protests first erupted in the wake of Amini's death in the Kurdish area where she was born, but it quickly spread to 81 different cities, 31 different provinces, so all the provinces. The people all over the country took to the streets and they chanted "Women like freedom." They chanted "Down with the dictator," "Down with the Islamic Republic." They set their headscarves on fire and they cut their hair in protest. And in early October, protests spread to the high schools where schoolgirls shed their hijab and refused to attend classes or else attended without hijab. There were strikes in the oil sector among school teachers, universities, truck drivers, and merchants. There was a vibrant protest movement online also. There was protest art, protest songs, citizen journalism, videos, and accounts of the protests. But not all these protests were nonviolent. Over the decades, we've seen an escalation in protester tactics from peaceful protests and sit-ins to more violent resistance, and this was no different. But arguably, it was at a new intensity, ferocity, and scale. So most of the violence had to do with attacking symbolically significant sites that represented government and state control and authority. So they torched police stations and government buildings. They set fire to homes, the home-turned museum of the founder of the Islamic Republic. They used homemade weapons and Molotov cocktails. There was reports of beating and even killing Basij and police. So now that we have that down, and I'm sure I missed some of those tactics, but this is just some of them. Okay. So let's talk about the regime response. As I said, it was comprehensive and on 3 operational levels. You have the physical and the kinetic, you have the cybernetic, and then you have the informational and rhetorical. So I'll talk about first the physical response by the regime. They beat protesters with batons. They used tear gas. They fired live ammunition into crowds. They used snipers and automatic weapons. They deployed armored vehicles, helicopters, and mounted police in some areas. They fired metal pellets into crowds and point blank at protesters' faces, killing and maiming hundreds, overflowing the hospitals with people with critical eye injuries. There was many reports of rape and molestation in prison and on the streets. They abducted people from their homes and work, never to be seen again. There was reports of people being taken to black sites and tortured. There was the arrest of journalists, artists, human rights activists, anyone expressing support for the movement online or in the streets. There was arrest of foreign nationals, and they even brought in proxies from Lebanon and from Iraq to help quell the protests. And so ultimately, this led to over 22,000 arrests, 22,000, and over 500 people murdered on the streets or in prison. So now that we talk about the physical, I want to talk about the cybernetic and the informational. And I promise I won't take too much more time. But on the cybernetic front, they instituted a nationwide internet blackout, and then also more targeted provincial and city level blackouts. They shut down cell phone services. They blocked access to popular social media platforms like WhatsApp and Instagram. They also leveraged the national internet, which is a state-controlled internet, cutting off people's access to the international web while maintaining this national network, which allowed for surveillance. For months, they imposed internet curfews, so people couldn't use apps or access the international web from a certain time during the evening to a certain time in the morning. They also, even in the throwback to 2009, filtered text messages. So if you wrote the keyword Amini, your message would not go through. And this served multiple ends, right? This served to undermine people's ability to organize protests, people's ability to see what other people were doing all over the nation and get inspiration from those protests. But most importantly, it allowed as a cover for the regime atrocities. And then finally, I'll talk about the kind of the rhetorical informational front. So information operations and the rhetoric was both inward and outward facing. Inward, the government launched extensive disinformation campaigns to manipulate public perception, divert blame, and justify its brutal crackdown. They launched disinformation campaigns blaming Amini's death on underlying health conditions. They sought to frame the street demonstrations as riots, not legitimate expressions of dissent. And they tried to say that these protests were the work of foreign agents and not organic. And then public officials and state-sponsored media tried also to justify the crackdown. So they said it was protecting citizens from dangerous elements. They labeled protesters in the majority Kurdish and Arab areas as secessionists forces, and they showed fake video of an armed revolt of the Kurds. And then they tried to turn the blame on the protesters themselves. For example, authorities tried to intimidate victims' families and tried to force them to admit that they didn't die at the hands of the authorities, but instead died at the hands of the protesters, even going so far as offering them money to say as much on video. And then also, I actually forgot to mention, when those schoolgirls took off their hijab and protested, they released chemicals into the air, which caused them poisoning. They had headaches, stomach aches, and many of them were hospitalized. And they actually blamed that on mass hysteria. Is that also interesting term? Use hysteria a lot when you talk about women. And so information operations also extended to the international front. And I'm just going to mention one, which is, in my mind, is particularly vicious. And it's that they attempted to turn the diaspora on each other, break ties among the diaspora. Specifically, they tried to frame certain members of the diaspora who were writing about the protest, who were reporting on the protests as agents of the regime, and then encourage other members of the diaspora to attack them. And this led in the harassment and death threats of members of the diaspora, those victims. And it led to self-censorship and people fearing for their lives. So ultimately, Sina, when we're thinking about the response to these protests, they were comprehensive and they were ruthless and they worked. Ultimately, after about 6 months, they were able to suppress dissent. But as we'll talk about, I'm sure later, women still went around the streets without hijab, and they still wore without hijab in defiance of the authorities in this brutal crackdown.
Can I ask you a follow-up before I go to Barbara? I apologize. You mentioned the internet. There was a discussion of Elon Musk that, at that time, Elon Musk was not the Elon Musk that we know today. and he promised that he will offer the Starlink, that the satellite internet to Iranians. There was a lot of rather welcoming news that he would do it. What happened to that Starlink?
So he did make it available. The problem is that was that there was no receivers on the ground, and that technology is really expensive. So what if there were such receivers and people had access to them, that would have been a part of the solution.
Sure, sure. And just to add one more thing to what you said, there was also a rather suspicious campaign of attacking schoolgirls in Iran. And, reportedly chemical agents were used, people had, stomach issues, etc. Yes, Barbara, as Shirley mentioned, you've been to Iran several times. You've interviewed a lot of Iranian officials, including the former Speaker of Parliament, Ali Larijani, a lot of people. What's your observation of these years that you've been to Iran and the years that you haven't been to Iran? What's your observation of the status of Iranian women?
First, let me thank GW. Let me thank the Athena Initiative. As I was thinking about this panel, Jon Stewart said recently that late night comics were what do you call them? The banana peel in the coal mine. I think women are the canary in the coal mine, and not just in Iran. When you start to persecute women, everybody else soon will follow. And so, even those who think this is just about women's issues, no, because it begins to affect the entire society. And I think that is clearly the case with Iran. What was the first thing the regime did when it came in? It forced women to wear the hijab. And the first protests, by the way, against the Islamic Republic were of women who did not want to wear the hijab.
On Women's Day.
Indeed, in 1979. So I think we should keep that in mind. In terms of my own experience in Iran, I first went there in 1996, specifically to write about the status of women. This was the year that the Taliban had taken power in Afghanistan for the first time. And of course, we know what the Taliban did then to women and is doing now. So I had a woman editor, and we decided I should go to Egypt, where I'd lived for 4 years, and sort of see what was going on there. And I said, I've always wanted to go to Iran. I've written about it from afar. I wrote about the revolution, from afar. I really would like to go and see what it's like on the ground. And I was able to get a visa, and I went. And of course, the reality of Iran was not at all like the stereotypical portrayals that one reads. I met incredible people, male and female, but the women especially were amazing. There were feminist publications that had been set up. There was a woman named Shahla Sherkat, who was the editor of a woman's magazine. I think it was called Zaman. There was the daughter of the then president, Rafsanjani, Faiza Hashemi, who is still quite a forceful figure, one can say, in her society. I know she's rather controversial, but one thing you can say is that she's got a lot of guts, and she's spent a lot of time in prison for her political activities in recent years. So I met this panoply of phenomenal women, and I think it's one of the reasons why I wanted to go back. And so I've gone back 9 times. I haven't been there since 2013. But even from 1996 to 2013, every time I went back, it would be, say, every 2 years or so, you could see the change. And where could you see the change? Women's dress. So when I first went, women were all draped. There's a phrase from Guy de Maupassant describing women in Saudi Arabia. He calls them death out for a walk, black. Each time I went, there were more colors, there was more variety, the coats got shorter, the pants got tighter, women were wearing makeup and so on, so that by the time of my last trip in 2013, there were already a lot of women in parts of Tehran who were not wearing hijab, particularly in the evening or in cars. So the fact that the regime still had this morality police, this boneheaded idea of the late President Raisi to bring back morality police and try to force women back into a stereotypical idea of Islamic dress. It ran counter to 40 years of women clawing their way slowly back into the world. One other anecdote, and I wrote about it in my book. In 2005, I had a trip to Iran, but I went first to Paris to do some interviews. And in the winter of 2005, French women were all wearing pink. It was in. Wasn't in Washington. We're always the last to know. I flew from Paris to Tehran. Women in Iran were wearing pink coats, pink scarves, pink shoes, carrying pink purses. So how did they get the memo? Because they were already on the internet. They were already seeing the pictures. They were already getting the fashion magazines. And they knew that pink was in. So within the limitations of their strictures, they wore pink. So I think that Women Life Freedom succeeded because all the people I talk to or who are in Iran or coming back from Iran say that hijab is dead. And yes, there are all these surveillance mechanisms, and Emily wrote about them beautifully. And sometimes your car gets impounded, and sometimes a cafe gets shut down for allowing women to come in without hijab. But women are still going without hijab. They cannot force them back into it. So in a sense, the social revolution, the cultural revolution has already occurred. And you add to that music, and drinking booze and film and art and all the other ways in which Iranian society has continued to evolve despite in the face of the Islamic Republic. And I think you have to admit that it is not the same country it was certainly 46 years ago. Now, you had another question I think you had for me about how the US handled these talks, right? We'll get to that. Okay.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
So for this panel, I spoke with my I write a lot with scholars based in Iran, especially women, and I asked about this specific question, and Barbara is absolutely correct. So even though there have not been any legal changes on the books, so there are no laws in Iran that currently say women are allowed to go without hijab. So that should be stated because the law is important. However, based on my conversations, it's happening, but it's happening in an uneven kind of manner. So, for instance, if you go into the universities, there are fewer women without hijab, but they're still there. But it's noticeable. There are few. If you're walking down the street, you're going to see a lot more. So it depends on where you're going. Even in government, like state government institutions, like if someone wants to go, I don't know, pay a bill or address a ticket or whatever, they're walking in without hijab. So I think this is happening, and it's happening definitely to some level of, personal risk. It could be societal backlash. It's not always the state, it's society that's conservative, and women might be harmed, as we know also in other contexts. So it is happening. The laws haven't changed, but I think it's worth recounting that as women started taking off the hijab, the National Security Council attempted to pass a law to kind of force these women in hijab again. And it was President Pezeshkian who stood against that and said, that goes against national security at this time, and you cannot do this. And he stopped that from passing. And so I think it's important to, when we talk about the future of freedom, not just in Iran, I agree with Barbara, everywhere. It's a collective struggle. It's a collective struggle that requires conversation within society, among civil rights organizations, and with state officials, and with people in power. And so we see that happening. And one of my co-authors in Iran told me yesterday, she said, we feel like this is a new chapter. We feel like things are changing. Something else that's really important that she mentioned to me about this conversation of hijab, she said women are no longer reactionary. Women are not in a position where they are like going after the state about this issue anymore. They are living their life. And so this is something that's also new that we had not seen before. I just wanted to add that, and absolutely Barbara's analysis is right on.
Speaking of, depending on the location that you're going, there's some shopping malls in northern Tehran, and guess who the owner is? It's the IRGC. And it happens that the morality police does not usually show up there to arrest people because the shop owners don't want to lose their businesses. which means that the mall is going to lose their businesses. So apparently there's some, some connection between them that, the morality police is not showing up there to ruin their businesses. But Emily, I do want to ask you something. Again, just pointing out to this instrument of coercion. You mentioned in the article that you wrote that the strategy apparently has changed in the Islamic Republic, that somewhat from physical enforcement of hijab to psychological pressure, uh, text messages, even picture like, like street cameras, but for hijab. Can you tell us more about those?
Yeah, I could say the attempt is psychological pressure. Whether or not it's successful is another thing. But yes, they instituted the NOR plan, which is it's a tech-heavy, surveillance-heavy strategy to try to implement the law. And this is a law, and the authorities are obligated to try to exact the law. So it basically uses surveillance to a higher degree. This is closed caption TV, and this is AI-enabled surveillance cameras. This is a kind of citizen reporting app called Nazer, which turns citizens into informants. There's something called ISM catchers, which kind of triangulates women. So if you're walking down the street and someone sees you not wearing hijab, it could hack into your phone, use your contact ID card, contactless ID card, and then triangulate with government databases to find out who you are and send you a text message warning you. And then not just doing that, but sending your male relatives a text message. So your father might call you and say, "What are you doing on the streets?" So trying to exact pressure that way. It ultimately, it's usually manifested in fines. People are getting fined a lot. Your car can be impounded, but nothing really more than that is what I understand.
I mean, there are some, amusing incidents too. The former deputy vice president of President Khatami, a couple of years ago, received a text message for not wearing hijab. Like he was driving the car, and apparently there was some misidentification by these, AI-powered, whatever they are, and they had thought that he's not wearing a hijab. So he had received one of those text messages that you didn't observe your hijab. Barbara, the U.S.
Yeah.
Right? Where's the U.S. in this?
Yeah, sure. You had asked me earlier, you wanted me to talk about how the Biden administration
Yes.
reacted to the protests in 2022. And if we remember, there was a lot of criticism of the Obama administration in 2009 when we had the Green Movement against fraudulent elections, presidential elections in Iran, that Obama had not done enough to support the Iranian people. And that was because he was interested in getting a nuclear deal. At least that was the complaint. I think it's fair to say that the Biden administration was much faster off the mark in terms of condemning the Iranian government for the killing of Mahsa and the repression of protests. And since this is UNGA week at the UN General Assembly, the annual high-level meetings, President Trump spoke today. Well, President Biden raised the death of Mahsa Amini in his speech to the UN General Assembly in September of 2022, just literally a week or so, or not even that, after Mahsa's death. And other senior officials from National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan to Secretary of State Tony Blinken repeatedly accused Iran of gravely abusing human rights. And one thing I particularly remember was in February of 2023 at the Grammys, First Lady Jill Biden awarded a special Grammy to the young Iranian who wrote what became the anthem of the protests, Baraya, if I'm pronouncing it right, enough, right? About why people were protesting and how fed up they were with everything in Iran. State and Treasury departments identified and sanctioned scores of Iranian officials and institutions for their roles in the crackdown, as well as Iran's arms transfers to Russia, which of course were going on at the time. At the same time, the Treasury Department issued general licenses to facilitate the provision of technology to make it easier for Iranians to overcome government filtering of the internet. And this was when we did see some Iranian activists use Starlink and other Western-based social media to amplify reports of protests and repression. Now, at the time, some of us were writing about this, and I think there was more the Biden administration could have done. It could have made it easier for Iranians in the United States to send remittances home to people who had lost their jobs, who were struggling to get by. Would have enabled more workers to go out on strike and not fear financial ruin. And a lot of us also advocated that sanctions be eased so that Iranians could work remotely for tech firms. I kept pushing for to make it easier for me to pay writers in Iran who were writing commentaries for me, and I still can't pay any of the writers I have in Iran. If they want to write for me, they have to do it for free because it's just too hard to get through the thicket of sanctions that has grown up over the years against Iran. So more could have been done, but I think actually in this instance, the Biden administration did pretty well.
Can I ask you a follow-up quick? The predicament that any U.S. administration has is when it wants to support the people in Iran, the Islamic Republic turns it around and says, "Look, we told you these people are the agents of the U.S. and the West." So, what is the proper? I mean, I know I'm asking a difficult question, but what do you think is the right place to be in? Where's the fine?
I think we support what people in the country are doing and don't try to substitute for them. The regime will always accuse outside agitators. I mean, Trump does it here when there's a protest he doesn't like. He says it's outside agitators, right, or some nefarious outside force, whatever. It's a standard in the playbook of authoritarians, and you just ignore it. And these were obviously homegrown demonstrations and protests, and so you support them. You amplify their voices. You make it easier for them to talk to each other and share information. That's the most important thing you can do, and then you let people take it from there.
Shirin, I do want to come to you. It's I guess I'm going to start with you, but I do want to ask the same question from Emily and Barbara. The arrest of young women who did not wear proper hijab is nothing new. I mean, it was always there, right? Especially after the Ahmadinejad administration. What was so special about Mahsa that made her a symbol, right? There are records of beating, things like that. What was so special about her? Was it, I don't want to give you the answer, but was it her ethnicity? Was it her background? What was it that made her so special? Why she became the symbol? Why she sparked a nationwide protest? That's the question I have.
Um, yeah, I think that's that's an easy question actually to
Oh.
answer. It's the end result of an accumulative process of grievances that was building up over time. So usually in moments like this, whether it's in Iran or anywhere else, there's a there's a process that was happening before it. And then there is what we call in political science a tipping point. And if political scientists could predict what that tipping point is, then we could predict revolutions, which we really cannot do, regardless of what some big political scientists might tell you. You can't predict these things. When do people collectively decide to come together and risk at personal risk for an issue? This is like a classic political science question that people struggle to answer. But it's because of a process. So if we go back and think about it, there was the arrest of Sepide Rashnu, if I remember
Yeah.
correctly. Sepide Rashnu was a young woman who was riding on a bus. She was attacked by another woman because of her hijab. She was arrested. And then she was brought before national TV to kind of confess to her crime. And she had visible signs of torture on her face, that she was beaten. And this really, I remember at that time, just following Iranian news kind of loosely, I noted mentally that it really upset people. There was something about that woman, in the middle of all the horrible things that are happening in the world, you bring this woman on television like this. So that struck a nerve. And then shortly thereafter, I think it was in like less than a month
Yeah.
that we have the arrest of Mahsa Amini and then her death in custody. So I think you have to see it as a part of that process. I also do want to add, though, it's important to recognize that what the uprisings for Mahsa Amini And I'm going to get into what was special about her, because I think there's a lot that's special about her as an individual. But that uprising included, it would not have happened if there were not many different grievances. I believe that. So for instance, a location that had the highest number of killings was Sistan and Baluchistan in the Kurdish region.
Southeast.
South, yeah. So why is that? You know, those regions are incredibly patriarchal. I don't personally believe that they were there fighting for women's rights. It was because of ethnic grievances. It was because of class grievances. And so for something like an uprising to occur, what political science has taught us, what the science has taught us, is that it takes usually more than just one issue. Now, to get to what was special about Mahsa Amini, I remember when her image first came out, my mother called me and she said, "She looks like you and your sister." And I wondered why she was saying that. And I went back. There's a video of her in the police station, and we can't hear the volume, but she's doing this, right? And she's of tribal region. She's Kurdish. My family is Bakhtiyari, so she's physically. Our women tend to be kind of stronger and more physical, and she's doing this in the face of the police.
Yeah.
And we don't know what she's saying, but a woman who does that in the face of danger is a woman who's been living like that her whole life. Right? So Mahsa Amini is not a poster that's circulated. She's not an image that's spoken for on Twitter by people who are writing and using her name for ulterior motives, which includes harming Iran, attacking Iran, and killing more women. When we talk about the future of women's freedom, we have to remember the 1,000 innocent women that were killed in the 12-day war when Israel illegally attacked Iran when it was in the middle of a negotiation.
I want to ask that question, by the way.
I will get to that.
Don't spoil.
I won't. But right. So Mahsa Amini was a radical, revolutionary Iranian woman, like so many other women in everyday life who've been standing up to power. I argue in my book that any of the changes that you see in Iran, it's because of women. They have been at the forefront. They sent their husbands to the war. They allowed their sons to go fight in the Iran-Iraq war. They sent their 20-year-old sons to go fire missiles when they knew they were going to be killed in the 12-day war. The mothers did that, right? And so,
Yep.
so Mahsa Amini represents those women. She embodied the woman, the ethnically discriminated woman. She was Kurdish. She embodied the generation. She was a young woman. She was in her like 21, 22 years old. 22 years old. She was innocent. There is nothing like being innocent and accused by the police and then being killed. We know that with the Black Lives Matter movement, right? With George Floyd. So, you know, all of that came together, I think, to cause this. But there are broader issues, and I argue that I believe hijab was absolutely one of them. There have been grievances against mandatory hijab dating back from Iranian women from the beginning of the revolution, as Barbara said, but even from the state, from elements within the state, from 20 years ago, they were saying, why do we have to keep doing this? Let people just, if they don't want to wear it, don't wear it, because it also creates duplicity, right? Like people are living different types of lives. So there's a long history to what happened, but there's also something special about Mahsa Amini, which I'm afraid has been hidden by all the people that are speaking on her behalf in the diaspora. And I do personally draw a distinction between the woman life freedom movement inside of Iran, which is sacred. It changed the structures. It was led by women and men supported them. It was one of the most visible instances where we saw Iranian men standing and defending and protecting Iranian women. And I think this is something that we don't talk about enough. But what we see in the diaspora is a move for regime change through force, through lobbying of the Trump administration. So you need to make a distinction between these two.
I do want to point out that there were 6,000 Iranian women who died in the Iran-Iraq war. Their names are not usually mentioned, but I think since it's an event about Iranian women, we should recognize it. Emily, if I may, I want to ask the same question from you. What do you think she was targeted? Why she became the symbol? Was it the ethnicity? Was it, I'm looking at, I'm sitting like 8,000 miles away, just looking at her picture, and I didn't know her. I felt that, she, as someone from a tribal region, you know, getting arrested in Tehran, she was what we call garibe in Persian. Like she was kind of a stranger in a big city that she didn't know much about. What do you think?
Well, I just want to note that veiled women really are a visible symbol of the government's level of control on a society. So they're black clad personifications of state power. So imagine what happens when women decide to shed that veil. Sina, I would turn it back on you actually.
Oh,
Why do you think it was this woman at this time?
oh, I wasn't expecting. I, my view is that um, the arresting officers, the people who arrested her, uh, thought that they're dealing with some young Kurdish girl who's not from Tehran, and you can probably guess from the accent, that the Farsi that she spoke, that she's not from Tehran, because Tehran has a distinct accent of its own compared to, let's say, Shiraz, Isfahan, Tabriz, or the Kurdish region. So they realized that, oh, like, she's not from this town. She was with her brother. So I feel like in her case, that's what they were thinking. And as you pointed out, maybe again, her being from a tribal background, she is not used to that sort of attitude. She tried to stand up to them, and that's the awful treatment that she got. That's my take. And I'm sitting again 8,000 miles away in D.C. Right, so that's the caveat.
I think it's just an accident in a way. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why the protests broke out, because it was just so random. And people, and you look at her picture, and she's wearing a headscarf, and she looks perfectly. I mean, compared to many women in Tehran,
Yeah.
perfectly modestly dressed. But it wasn't good enough for maybe they had a quota like ICE. Who knows? They had to pick up so many people and fill up the van
They do
on
actually.
a given day.
Yeah.
It could have been as simple as that, and it was just an accident, and then it spiraled out of control, and it touched people, and they said enough.
Yeah.
I'm going out in the street.
And by the way, just to give you a little context, when you look at the pictures from the regime-sponsored events, let's say on the anniversary of the Iranian Revolution, or the rituals for the Imam Hussein death and the Battle of Karbala, some of the pictures that you see from women who are pretty much unveiled, and you compare them to the conditions under which they arrested Mahsa, she was very much covered compared to these women. So again, if I have to guess why she was targeted, I thought that I do know that they have quotas to meet. They found someone who's not from the area, and as we say, they found a garibe in Persian, a stranger in the town. That's my assessment. So we did discuss the U.S. Why her? I do want to talk about sanctions, and you mentioned the 12-day war, and then we got 15 minutes, right? More recent, what have been the impacts of these two? I mean, one event, the 12-day war. If you could tell us, and sanctions, Barbara, you've done a lot of work on sanctions. If you can start with sanctions, and then Emily and Shirin, please.
Maybe I'll speak a little bit to both, because I think that what's been amazing about Iran all these years is that civil society has managed to perpetuate itself in the face of so many problems and so much repression. We've had environmental movements, women's movements, all sorts of movements of people throughout the last decades. And sanctions and the war, I think, both have hurt civil society. They undercut people's livelihoods. So, as I mentioned, it becomes more difficult to go out on strike, to risk your livelihood in support of a cause. And the war in particular, the Israelis thought that they would bring down the regime, and they targeted regime leaders. They still, I'm hearing people think that they're going to come back again and try to kill the supreme leader, that that's, you know, their goal. Pezeshkian was targeted, you know, I mean, not exactly a hugely powerful individual, but he is the president. And so the Israelis thought, aha, this is going to bring down the regime. And what happened was there was a nationalist backlash against the Israelis. And many Iranians sympathized with the Israelis. I remember when the Gaza war broke out, a lot of Iranians said, to hell with the Palestinians, the Israelis are absolutely right. But this action of attacking the Iranian homeland, not just pinpoint assassinations of individual scientists or you know, officials of the regime, which Israel has done for a long time, but strikes on residential buildings that killed innocent civilians, hitting Evin prison and killing prisoners and families of prisoners who'd gone to see political prisoners at Evin prison. These kinds of actions alienated people and actually gave the regime a bit of a boost, and then, of course, made it easier for them, as if they needed an excuse to ramp up repression, arrest more people, execute more people, go on a paranoid hunt for Mossad spies everywhere. Were they really spies? Were they just people they didn't like? We don't know. So it's the exact wrong way to go about promoting change in Iran, peaceful evolution to a better and more representative and more humane system. But this has been US policy, and it's gotten worse, frankly, in the last few months.
No, and you can go ahead. Yes,
No, Taruf, please, go ahead.
I would just say that I think, one, I think I agree totally with what Barbara's saying. It's just an excuse for the regime to crack down. My question, though, to the panel, I'm sorry I'm asking questions to the panel, is did the apparent display of weakness of the regime and the inability to hit back meaningfully, and the fact that so many members of the ruling establishment were hit and the military apparatus, did this in fact embolden women? What would you say? Embolden women
Sense.
to not wear hijab, to push back against the state?
This is a tough one. You go for it.
No, that's a good question. I mean, it's obvious that Iran experienced, without a question, without a doubt, intelligence failure for sure, in the 12-day war. I mean, again, I also want to stress, I'm in the United States. I don't travel to Iran. So everything that you're hearing is based on us from a distance, right? So that's an important thing to state. But based on my conversations with contacts and friends, and also following the news and the research, I don't think that women in Iran, and this unfortunately is misinformation that's been fed to the American public by factions of the diaspora and the ultra right and the US government. I don't believe that Iranian women are conflating hijab with a foreign intervention. You have to understand that when they were attacked, there was nobody there to protect them except Iran's military and the Revolutionary Guards. So the people rallying around the flag is not necessarily an indicator that they are supporters of like the current government. There was no one there to protect them. I had a friend who even said to me, maybe if, you know, the United States had not sanctioned Iran since, you know, forever, since the 1979 revolution, maybe if Israel had not been participating in covert operations and supporting sanctions that are harming everyday people, maybe the Iranian people's reaction would have been different when it was attacked, right? Maybe that dream and fantasy that exists within parts of the diaspora, that Iranians would go with open arms towards their attacker, maybe it would happen, but that's not what happened. They were standing with the people that were protecting them, that were risking their lives. And that is completely a human thing to do. It's a natural thing to do. And that's what people did. I don't think we need to read into it to mean like that Iran has found this new central like support, that the structure, no, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're very strong. But what I do believe is that, like Barbara was suggesting, for many Iranians, they now understand that their struggle is not disconnected from the Palestinian one, and they understand that Israel is a genocidal state, is a terrorist state, and is posing a threat to people in the region and not just to Palestinians. And so in that sense, I would argue that that changes the dynamics within Iran.
I will add one thing on, the notion of bombing campaigns and democracy. When you look at the history of air campaigns in Yugoslavia, Iraq, Japan, or Germany in World War II, there is no single incident that air campaigns have led to democracy. Japan in World War II was under air campaigns, fire bombs. Germany was being firebombed, but you didn't see anyone rising up against their brutal regimes. In Yugoslavia, same case. In the case of Iraq in 1991, there were massive air campaigns, and I'm sure you all know of this, but nobody came to the streets to topple Saddam. It was only a boots on the ground, an occupation that actually led to the toppling of the regime. And as the only realist here, sorry, um, uh, uh, nationalism is the most powerful, twice, yes, the most powerful force on earth. Yes, absolutely. There's no question that people in Iran are very resentful of the regime. They despise the regime. But at the end of the day, what you said, uh, at the end of the day, they have to seek protection from the state. It is the state that is capable now, in whatever they have, of responding. That's just political science and history of air campaigns, which I love. Can we do? Okay, Barbara, Emily, anyone?
But can I just add one thing that goes
Sure.
along with Barbara was saying? Because I am one of those academics that was put on those lists in the United States. It was under the Biden administration. It was Biden administration's I cannot remember her name, but she was the person in charge of national security who first stated that the uprisings on US campuses was because of professors and because of, and I'm sorry, not professors, infiltration from Iran, which was
Oh,
really
yeah.
shocking
Yeah.
to me.
The Gaza?
No, on US campuses.
Iranian inspired?
Yes, via social media. And they said that. And this is so familiar because this is often what you hear in authoritarian states that they say people are being tricked through social media and chats.
Yeah, and I'll add one thing that I think when the January 6th attacks on Congress started, there was, and this is not a joke, a Republican congresswoman had said that I thought it's the Iranians. So no, this is serious. She actually said it.
So so the suppression of protests on US campuses started with the Biden administration and somehow like continued with Trump. I just want to say that because I think it's like, but I do agree with you that definitely the Democrats are better in conversation with Iran than Trump.
Q&A. Yep. Okay, we're going to open it up Q&A. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much. Such an interesting panel. I was wondering, Dr. Shirin, if you could describe, I would love to hear you describe why you think that the incidence of women not wearing the hijab is far fewer on college campuses than elsewhere in society, because it kind of relates to what you were just talking about. Thanks.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a very good question. I think, well, for one, many students are afraid that their professors may not allow them to stay in class because my friend that I was speaking with, her father's a professor, and he said he doesn't have a problem, and they're sitting in class. But it might be the case that other professors will not. It might be the case that they are expelled from the university. And so the university is generally, I would argue, in similar ways that we're seeing in the US, highly securitized. And so it's an immediate contact with the state. So it's kind of like going directly into the belly of the beast. And maybe they are afraid of that. That's a good question.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Fariba Parsa, and I was born in Iran. I was also witnessed the Islamic Revolution. that is a comment with Shirin, yeah, about the women activism. I thought that's correct, and I witnessed the women who were very religious come out. But one thing that is so important, we should not forget, the law about women was backward. Immediately after the Islamic Revolution, the legal age for marriage set down to 9 years. And also a man was easily to marry 4 women at once. There's about marriage, about divorce. There are so many laws just after the Islamic Revolution. We witnessed backwards. It also punished, for example, different punish like cutting hands and legs. It has been immediately after the Islamic Revolution, and I was witness because I lived in Iran and I saw it. This is my comment. And then I have a question. Iran is not the only Islamic country in the world. We have so many Islamic countries in Saudi Arabia, all these countries. What is interesting for me, there is only 2 countries in the entire world, Iran and Afghanistan. They have forced hijab for women. Even you have a Mecca, Saudi Arabian, and all these very, very Islamic countries, none of them have this law for women's hijab. There is women in Saudi
Can I
Arabia.
say something that the Saudi case is recent, because up until just a few years ago, women had to cover. And I remember a trip to Saudi Arabia, I think it was in 2002, where I was chased through a woman's floor on in a shopping mall because I wasn't wearing a headscarf.
Okay.
I was only
Okay,
wearing a
other countries like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, all the yes, that is the reason why Iran, and that is the question, why the Islamic regime in Iran so much upset for women's hijab. And
Yeah, so the
yeah,
question is- yes.
why?
Yeah, what's the obsession with?
Yeah, why they are so much
Sure.
arresting? And about the Mahsa Amini, I know there are more women have been killed because of their hijab. We don't know their names. We don't know who they are. But from some friends, I know it. But you say why Mahsa Amini was exceptional? Why? So I agree with all of you. With one other things that we can add.
Sorry, I apologize. I don't mean to be rude, but for the sake of getting more
Okay.
questions,
Yes, thank you.
I'm very sorry. I just want to keep the
I-
conversation going.
Good question. It's a very good question. Why is there in Afghanistan and Iran, there was legally imposed hijab? That's a good question. And we don't see that in other contexts. I think that's something that people can think about. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, she had her hand up, and after you, I just got a question from media.
Hi,
Go ahead.
thank you so much for
Could you
being here.
please introduce yourselves.
Yeah.
Thank you.
My name's Laura, and I'm a student here at the Elliott School. Thank you all so much. This is a very important discussion. My one question is, if we're standing against authoritarianism, why do we keep calling her Mahsa?
Sorry, what was this?
Why do we keep calling her Mahsa?
That was her name, right?
That is her assigned name, not her assigned name, his Persian name that she never used. It says Gina
No.
on her gravestone.
Well, I don't think there's any, malicious intentions. I just think that Mahsa, everybody used.
Right. I
Mahsa.
think symbolically, if we're against authoritarianism, we should also be against their rules of not allowing Kurdish names.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Not a problem. Yeah. I do want to point out, good question. I do want to point out this notion of the Persianization of Iran started under the Reza Shah Pahlavi, who forced everybody in Azeri areas, in Kurdish areas, to be educated in Persian, and if they did not, they would be disciplined, right? I do have a question from BBC, so I'll use my perks as a moderator. So the question is, as members of academia, hold on, sorry. What solutions can you, as members of academia, suggest to help mend this broken society towards a more united one that embraces different points of views and beliefs without so much, name calling, hatred, things like that? So what can we do? Like, what can society do? Barbara.
Change our policy toward Iran. I mean, we've had 46 years of failure. At some point you have to say, is it just their fault? Or maybe did we do something wrong? I think Iran has made many, many grave errors. And I would argue now that the whole nuclear program looks like the most expensive mistake in the history of the Islamic Republic, given what it's brought, the misery it's brought. But there were opportunities after 9/11 in particular, which I wrote about extensively in my book, when the US and Iran were on the same side. Iran supported us in getting rid of the Taliban. And George W. Bush put them on the axis of evil in a 2002 speech. And then, of course, we had the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal negotiated by Obama, and Trump pulled out of it in 2018 when Iran was in full compliance with it and slapped back the sanctions. Now, Iran had opportunities to get back into that agreement in 2001 and 2002. And it blew those opportunities for a variety of reasons, which could be a topic for another panel. But the initial violation came from the United States, not from Iran. And then to top it all off, to give the green light to the Israelis to bomb Iran while Iran was in the process of negotiating with the United States about this nuclear program, and then to join the unprovoked attack on Iran at the end of this war were not steps that help civil society in that country. And in the end have made, it has weakened the regime. I still think that there are possibilities for major changes, perhaps when Ayatollah Khamenei dies. But I think what the US has done, particularly in recent years, has set back the cause of progress in that country.
LexisNexis, anybody use it? ProQuest, anybody use it? Iranian students are trying to access this wealth of knowledge, which they cannot access. That would be number one, opening up the world of knowledge to Iranians. I would say number two is actually academic exchanges. If I had a wish to grant here, I'd like to have student exchanges. I would like to have more people learn Farsi and go to Iran to learn. There's some great universities there. And then more visas for Iranians. Let's welcome Iranians here. And if they want to stay, that's absolutely wonderful. I personally am absolutely against the regime. So if I can encourage brain drain, I absolutely will, because we have people who have a lot to give our society.
Yeah, 2 quick points on what you pointed out. First, on Persian language, we have a great professor, Moaziyar Mutamed. Those of you who had him, please take his classes. And second, if I may, you pointed out to something. Look, if you want democracy, you have to practice it. You can't be a secret Islamic republic yourself, try to suppress any voices that you don't like, and you say, hey, I want a national dialogue and I want democracy for the future of Iran. Democracy actually involves listening to the voices that you may not necessarily like or agree with. And this is something that we do want to practice. And one last point on the issue of sanctions. I've had graduate students who have had written on how sanctions impact U.S. Iranian education system. Yes, Iranian citizens cannot use US-based platforms for education. edX is, for example, banned for Iranians. If you're an Iranian citizen, you cannot get certificates from edX or other online educational platforms, right? So I think this is something that, we do say that, the US says we want to support the Iranian people, and I believe it, but there are words and there are actions. If you ban Iranians from coming to the US, and most of them actually, despise the regime, if you ban them from coming, you're actually adding to the propaganda of the Islamic Republic that the US actually hates you. We like you, and the
Sina,
US hates you.
I was just informed that there's over 600 Iranians who've been picked up by ICE
Yes,
recently.
absolutely.
So that doesn't send a very
Baha'i
good message.
lady.
Doesn't send
Yes,
a very good
yes.
message
So as you all know, Baha'is are prosecuted in Iran. And this Baha'i lady who fled Iran, the fear of prosecution, was arrested and detained by ICE after having a green card for many years, right? Next question, anyone? Yes, sir.
I'm Max. I go to GW here. So I think, Ms. Saeidi, you mentioned kind of talking about the 12-day war that happened, Israel looking to kind of topple Iran's current regime. I think what we can kind of see, at least in the past couple of years with the conflict in Gaza, the Israeli idea of a war against a regime is very prolonged, very bloody. And I know it's kind of very difficult from all the way on this side of the world, but if something like that were to prolong and continue happening between Iran and Israel, I know it's a very different situation, but do we have a sense of what it feels and looks like to be in the public in Iran during wartime, especially for women and activists?
I'll share you my experience, things that I've heard, and is that most people fled Tehran. There was actually a rather awkward or strange evacuation order by the IDF that the residents of Tehran's 3rd district need to leave immediately. And 3rd district is one of the largest districts of Tehran. And Tehran, for those of you who don't know, has a population of around 10 million people, right? So one of the districts of Tehran is probably, I don't know, 400,000, 300,000, I don't know the exact numbers. And people had to flee Tehran, major cities. Everybody went to the northern Iran, that is, we call it Shomal, by the Caspian Sea. It's a beautiful place. And they had to stay there. But I also saw when we say nationalism, there were a lot of this surging nationalism that led Iranians help each other, especially those who fled Tehran. They went to the northern parts of the country. They were helping each other with food, logistical support, fuel, even. So that's the things that I've heard. Again, if you heard anything, and slowly but surely, people are trying to go back to their normal lives, if it's even possible, because everybody in Tehran and most major cities think that this ceasefire is fragile. There's going to be a second round, and I think that this is an assessment of the government too.
I think your question had to do with what it's like to be in a war in a country like that, and I think of the Iran-Iraq War, and Saddam Hussein attacked Iran in 1980, thinking he could bring down the regime, and instead he solidified the Islamic Republic because people defended their homeland. So I don't think the Israelis, they don't have, it's a small country, small military, which is already overtaxed by what's been going on in Gaza. So they're not going to be invading. The U.S. isn't going to be invading, but there obviously will be more attacks from the air, more assassinations, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Leila, please.
Hi, everyone. I too am a political scientist, and this is a question that I've grappled with. And we can even zoom out from Iran. But I'm intrigued by how cultural movements or cultural revolutions actually then translate into legal and political and social reforms. So some of those more tangible things. Very interested to hear your opinion.
Can I add one quick note because it's relevant to what Shirin said, and I'll let you guys answer it. After the Mahsa movement, there was a lot of pushback from Iran's the hardliner camp of the Iranian parliament. They quickly passed a legislation which severely expanded the punishment for not observing hijab. Now, I believe the assessment of the Pezeshkian administration was that this law, and this is the argument that they made, was that this law does not serve the interests of the Islamic Republic in long term. It's going to create chaos. and based on the media reports that I read, Pezeshkian had pushed for not implementing the law. So there is a law, but it's not being implemented, like many laws that are out there in Iran, but they're not being implemented. So, but I do want to open it like Emily, Barbara, Shirin.
You know, I mean, there have been changes to the personal status law. This lady was absolutely right. They threw out a very progressive law that had been passed under the Shah. And I think the marriage age was 18 under the Shah. They bumped it back to 9, which is the figure in the Quran. It's now 13, but in practice, that's very, very rare. It's usually much older than that. And there have been changes that have made it easier for women to get divorced. So, you know, it's not enough and it's been very slow. But the women's movement in Iran goes back, and you know there was a petition campaign. What was it? The 1 million signature campaign, I believe it was called. Yeah,
1 million signatures.
1 million signatures. So the push to change some of these, to change the inheritance laws, that kind of thing. It's minor, but it occurred, and that was long before the Women Life Freedom. So Women Life Freedom was building on these other campaigns that, you know, go back to the 90s with Shahla Sherkat and the feminist publications that I mentioned earlier.
Anybody else?
I would just say that culture is the Achilles heel of this regime. It is in culture that the Islamic Republic was born. The first thing that the authorities did was to force the Islamization of society. And it's culture that is the most contested space in Iran today and has been. There's something called soft war that kind of embodied this paranoia about the US in particular and its influence through media and information and how that could actually lead to the downfall of the regime. And so I think you're absolutely right. It's culture that's really going to lead to revolution in my mind.
Excuse me. I think we're done, right? Okay, thank you. So we're going to wrap it up. I do want to thank Shirin, Emily, Barbara for coming. We are going to have more events, and I think we can wrap it up. Thank you very much.